Do you ever feel like a real screw-up? You know, you try your best to do things and everything, all the best intentions just seem to fall apart and something bad always seems to happen. There's always a monkey wrench in there somewhere. Or you do everything well and then the one time you make one mistake, everybody reminds you of it and they'll never let you forget about that one little mistake you made. Well, if you've ever felt that way, don't worry, you're in good company because you're in the same company as St. Peter. I've always loved St. Peter, not just because Peter is my middle name, but I've always been able to identify with him because he seems to be the best of human nature personified. Peter means very well in everything he does, but something always seems to go wrong somewhere whenever Peter does something, doesn't it? You notice he's the only apostle that Jesus ever got angry at, yelled at, and called him a Satan. He always seems to be able to put his foot in his mouth and ruin something beautiful that he's doing. Look, for example, let's go back to the Last Supper. Jesus is with the apostles and he tells them, I'm going away. Where I am going, you cannot come now. And Peter says, why can I not come with you? I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus says to him, you'll lay down your life for me, Peter? I assure you the cock will not crow this evening until you have 3 times denied you even know me. No, Lord, I would never do that. But then again, we know what happened just a few hours later in the courtyard of the high priest's house. When the servant girl looks at him and says, wait a minute, I know you. You were with that Jesus. You're one of his followers. Did he say, yes, I am, and I'm proud of it because I love him? No, he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I do not know him. Not once or twice, but 3 times. And then the cock crows, and Jesus is sitting there. Luke tells us he turns and looks right at him, and Peter realizes what he did and went off and wept bitterly. But notice what Peter did not do. Unlike Judas Iscariot, who when he realized what he did went off and hanged himself, Peter wept bitterly, but he was still there. He still gathered with the apostles in the upper room afterwards. He didn't give up, even though he had done something really wrong. He denied 3 times that he even knew who Jesus was. And of course, last week we talked about the first appearance of Jesus to the apostles after he was risen from the dead. And once they realized him, in the back of their mind eventually must have been the thought they must be ready to get their comeuppance, that Jesus is going to take them to task for the fact that they weren't there for him, but he doesn't. And especially Peter more than any of the others because he's the only one who spoke up and denied Jesus. And Jesus never says anything to him about it that day. And a week later, when they gather again, and this time Thomas is there and he talks to Thomas and does all these other things, he never says anything to Peter about it. And Peter is probably wondering, the Lord's going to address this eventually. He's going to bring it up to me. There has to be resolution to this. He knows that. When is he going to do it? Will he do it? And indeed, the Lord does do it, but not in the way that Peter imagines. We hear it today in our gospel reading. Even after the 2 times they saw him risen, they go to Galilee. Now, Jesus had told them, go to Galilee, told Mary Magdalene, tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. So they do, and they're sitting by the Sea of Tiberias, which is another name for the Sea of Galilee. And it was on the very sea that Jesus had performed the miraculous catch of fish, when he went out in Peter's boat and caught such a tremendous catch of fish that Peter turned and said, leave me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. And Jesus said, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. And with that, he left his nets and everything, and they followed him. And he never went back to his fishing. Now here he is back in Galilee, waiting for Jesus, because he said he would show himself to them. And twice he had already shown himself risen from the dead. But he's not there. And Peter says, I'm going fishing. He's going back to his old life, to everything he left behind. Even though he's seen the Lord risen twice, still the reality of what it meant for them had not kicked in. And he goes back to his old life, fishing. And once again, of course, he's not doing it well. They caught nothing all night. Jesus is there at dawn on the shore, and he repeats the same miracle by which he found him. Have you caught anything? Nothing. Cast your net to the right side. They do. They catch more fish than they've ever caught before. The nets cannot hold the fish, 153 very large fish, and they have a hard time bringing in all these fish. It was more than they had ever done before. And this time it's John who recognizes it's the Lord. And when Peter hears that, notice what he does. Now, Peter still has that guilt within him about what he did. But I've always loved Peter's response here. When he hears that it is Jesus, he tucks in his clothing and he jumps into the sea and swims to the shore. He still rushes to Jesus. Even though he denied him that night, he hasn't abandoned him. Somehow he still knows he has a place to play in Christ's plan. And so he jumps out of the boat into the water. Reminds us of when Jesus called him to walk on the water. He goes into the water and swims to the shore. They bring the boat in, and Jesus has the fire there, and they sit down to the meal. And nobody asks him, "Who are you?" because they know who he is. Finally, the moment comes that Jesus is going to call Peter to task, if you will, for what he said, but he does it in a completely different way. Simon. He calls him by his original name. Remember, his name was Simon. His father was John or Jonah. Jesus changed his name to Peter, but he says to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep." A second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Feed my lambs." A third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter's annoyed. "Lord, why are you asking me this? You know that I love you." He doesn't even realize what Jesus is doing for him. 3 times Peter denied Jesus out of fear. 3 times now Jesus has him reaffirm him out of love. And each time he tells him, "Feed my sheep, tend my flock, feed my lambs." Who does that as a living? A shepherd does. Peter was a fisherman, but he calls him now to be a shepherd. And remember, Jesus took that title, which we're actually going to hear next Sunday. "I am the good shepherd." They had heard him say that. He, the good shepherd, the shepherd of Israel in the Old Testament. Who was the shepherd of Israel? God himself. "The Lord is my shepherd. There is nothing I shall want." "O shepherd of Israel, hear us, you who lead Joseph's flock." And so Jesus took that title upon himself and now reaffirms Peter in being the shepherd of the flock. In other words, restoring to him what he probably thought he had lost by denying him. Reaffirming in Peter everything he had done for him that day at Caesarea Philippi when Jesus asked the apostles, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "I say you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says to him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, and so I declare you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven, and whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven." He reaffirms his call to him, tells him basically that I've not lost faith in you simply because you were weak that evening. He also realized Peter had been strong for a while. Remember, as we talked about last week, he actually took up a sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. But Jesus said, "No, don't do that." He made him stop. He even followed to see what would happen. But eventually his strength just failed. And when the servant girl saw him, that's when he fell apart. But Jesus pretty much tells him here, "I still will do great things through you, even though you have fallen." He rehabilitates him. In a way, we can say that was Peter's confession. He went to confession for the first time that day, and Jesus returned him to his glory. And then he says a few other things. He gives him an amazing prophecy. Just as he prophesied to him and told him, "The jaws of death will not prevail against the church that I will build on you." He says, "When you were young, you dressed and went about as you wanted. But when you go older, someone else will bind your hands and lead you where you do not want to go." And that was a reference that anybody in Jesus' time would understand as a reference to crucifixion. And St. John even adds, he said this indicating the type of death by which Peter would glorify God. And we know, of course, that Peter was crucified for the Lord. And when Peter was led to be crucified, he requested to be crucified upside down because he said he was not worthy to suffer in the same way Jesus did. And those words of Jesus at the Last Supper to Peter, "You cannot follow me now, but later you will," now came back to him because 30 some odd years later, he did follow the Lord to the cross. What he was too weak to do that day, ultimately he did do when he was completely strengthened. And then he says those 2 most important words that anyone hears from the Lord, "Follow me." And Peter, we know, did follow him after that. And after Pentecost, he was the leader, strongly standing up before even the Sanhedrin. We heard that in our first reading where they said, "We gave you strict orders not to talk about that name." They don't even want to mention Jesus by name. Yet you fill Jerusalem with your teaching and determined to make us responsible for his blood. And does Peter say, oh, I'm sorry, I won't do it anymore? No. He says, better for us to obey God than men. God sent the Messiah to you, and you crucified him. They're trying to throw the guilt off themselves. And you're determined to make us responsible for his blood. Well, reality check, they were. They just didn't want to take acknowledgement for it. And Peter holds them to it. And he's a strong leader until the day of his crucifixion. He wouldn't be without mistakes. There was even the one time where Paul has to call him to his senses, that he was trying not to cause trouble with James over the question of eating with circumcised people. And so he made a mistake here or there, as nobody who follows Jesus is ever guaranteed that he's never going to make a mistake. But the Lord does not reject us simply because we made a mistake, especially if we turn back to him. And sometimes that happens to us over and over again. We find that we sin, we turn against the Lord, and yet he still brings us back to him. I remember one time in my life where that happened in a very poignant way to me, that I experienced very much of what I think St. Peter was going through. It wasn't here at St. Anne's, it was in a previous parish where I was, but I had some woman who had come up to me on a situation, and she got in my face, and she was really downright nasty in the way she spoke to me. And that day, I just blew it. Any cool I might have had in my nature was lost, and I gave her both barrels of the gun. How dare you speak to me like that? How dare you accuse me? And what she had to say was definitely wrong. She was falsely accusing me of in putting all sorts of motives into a decision I made or something I said and they were totally off. But I gave it to her. I laid her flat. And later, as I was praying, I felt horrible. I felt as if the Lord was saying, Father Carrozza, I expect better from you. You are better than that. That's not the way you're meant to treat the sheep of your flock. And I felt so guilty that I felt, maybe the Lord should be just fed up with me and say, I never want to see you again. Get out of my sight. The only problem is I had a funeral to do the next morning. There was no opportunity to go to confession beforehand, and I just had to go ahead and do this funeral. And the funeral was a difficult one. It was a father leaving behind a wife and 4 very young children. And as I got up into the pulpit to try to say something to comfort this woman and bring Christ to them, I felt like the biggest hypocrite in the world. Who am I to try to bring Christ to these people when I didn't bring Christ to that woman the night before? But I went up and did the best I could. And after the funeral was over, the wife came up to me with tears in her eyes, and she said, Father, thank you. That was so beautiful. You gave us such peace. You gave us such comfort. And you gave us words, something to the effect of that will help us move on and everything. And she was really saying something like, you did a great job. It wasn't just niceties that she was saying. She really had tremendous praise for me. And as she walked away, it's as if I heard the Lord saying to me in my heart, of course I'm not rejecting you. I'm not throwing you out just because you committed one sin, just because you were not the way you should have been one night. I forgive you. I will still restore you. And he's done that for me over and over again. Whenever I've made a mistake and I acknowledge it before him, he always forgives me. And you know what? He always forgives you too. So if you've done something and you feel like, oh, how could God ever forgive me? He will. He always does. He never loses patience with us. In fact, the fact that we acknowledge our weakness is often what makes us the best servants of the Lord. People who tell us how great they are probably not going to serve the Lord very well. But people who say, Lord, who am I with all of my weakness and all of my sin that you will call me? When we acknowledge that, the Lord can do great things through us. As St. Paul once said when he talked about his thorn in the flesh, whatever it was, and the Lord said, my grace is enough for you, for in your weakness my power reaches perfection. The same thing can happen to us when we acknowledge our weaknesses before the Lord, whether there are faults or shortcomings in character or the sins we've committed, whatever it may be, bring it to the Lord. Do not be afraid. If you screwed up, all right, bring it to the Lord and let him scrub you up and let him clean you and restore you to what he once had with you, perhaps, maybe something we did lose by sin, but let him restore you, let him reinforce you. and you will continue to serve him. You will still make mistakes again. I know I will. I will have to go to confession again in the future. There's no question in my mind. We all will have to do this throughout our lives. But remember, the Lord never tires in calling us back to the call that he gives us from the very beginning. So are you a screw up? Then be a scrub up. Allow the Lord to clean you up. Allow him to embrace you again, to restore you to the dignity that perhaps we lost in a weak moment, but help us realize just how much he loves us, and follow him when we hear that most important word that he says to each and every one of us, follow me. May Jesus Christ be praised.